Daisy 24/7.
Romans 8:22 affirms that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain because of what has happened to Adam and Eve, and by extension to the whole universe. So we have all kinds of disasters taking place in our world today. We have earthquakes, we have tornadoes, we have hurricanes. Is it because of sin? Are these earthquakes meant to happen all the time? Or can they actually be considered as acts of God? Simply put, are disasters of this kind natural or supernatural? Here with me from the Seismic Research Center of the University of the West Indies, Dr. Joan Latchman. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on JC 24/7.
Thank you for inviting us.
Well, let's get a question rolling one time. What are earthquakes and how are they formed?
Earthquakes are energy waves traveling through the Earth's crust. They are generated when a fault ruptures and the energy that was stored in that fault is released as waves traveling through the crust. The Earth's crust is made up of a small number of rigid plates traveling across the semi-molten mantle relative to each other. And because of frictional forces, strain and energy accumulates along these boundaries, which are made up of faults, and they will accommodate the strain energy, and when they can no longer accommodate that strain energy, they rupture. Small faults accommodate small levels of energy, and bigger faults, bigger levels.
Beautiful. I know we have heard different categories of earthquakes, magnitude 1, 2, 3. I'm not sure how far up they can go up the Richter scale. What determines the magnitude of earthquakes?
Okay, the scale was first developed by Charles Richter, and he did this to be able to distinguish between different sizes of earthquakes in California. And because it's such a useful scale in being able to distinguish sizes of earthquakes, it is now generally used. And it's because of this that it carries his name. Seismologists tend to use what is called now the moment magnitude scale, which tells you that there are different scales in measuring earthquakes, but it really is a measure that's related to the energy released by the earthquake at its source. So when you hear magnitude, you can have, it's an open-ended scale actually, so there is no lower bound and there is no upper bound. The upper bound is considered to be constrained by how much strain energy the rocks themselves can hold. There's another scale that you will hear, intensity scale, which is what you feel. So depending on how close you are to that earthquake, you can feel the shaking more strongly or less strongly, depending on distance. So the closer you are, the more strongly you would feel the shaking, and the further away you are, the less strongly.
Beautiful. And does it have anything to do with how long the earthquake lasts? That the devastation would be more catastrophic?
Certainly, indeed. One should bear in mind that the magnitude of an earthquake does relate to how long the shaking lasts. So the bigger the earthquake, the longer will be the shaking. So most of us are very familiar with the smaller earthquakes that we have, or possibly on a monthly level, 3.5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 4.1, 2, 3, 4. Those small earthquakes, we may feel the shaking for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds, depending on where we live within Trinidad and Tobago. But the strongest earthquakes, shaking can continue for 2 minutes, for 3 minutes, for 5 minutes. And if you get that level of shaking for that length of time, that's when your damage is going to be the disaster that you are describing. Of course, the minor damage that you begin to see happening will occur when shaking persists for 25, 30 seconds.
I tend to panic when there's about a few seconds of shaking. You're talking about 2, 3 minutes of shaking. I'll quickly implode by the time the earthquake is finished. Back in 2004 was the first time I ever heard of the term tsunami. When in Japan, the Asian tsunamis. Sumatra, right. Back in December, I believe, Boxing Day.
That's right.
What is a tsunami and how is it related to earthquakes?
Okay, so first I would say that most people would have heard the term tsunami for the first time then, but I'm sure everyone had heard of the term tidal wave.
Sure.
Now, a tidal wave and a tsunami are the same thing, but tsunami waves have nothing to do with tides, and this is why scientists wanted to find a word that described and was associated with what these waves are. And they are waves that are generated by earthquakes that have occurred under the sea or by a fault that has ruptured into the sea. Now, you can have different types of motion on a fault. Your fault can move vertically, or your fault can move horizontally. In general, the horizontal faults don't generate tsunamis, but they can, because you can have tsunamis generated also when shaking causes a large mass of material to fall into the sea and displace a large volume of water. But in general, it is that vertical motion in the fault movement. So the fault moves up, the column of water over the fault is displaced. So you have a big earthquake, magnitude 7 or so, over a column of water 1,000 meters or so, and you generate that nice large tsunami.
Nice.
And, or maybe nice is not that impressive. Yes, that impressive tsunami. The wave, as it gets to the surface, it splits in two. Bear in mind that all the material on the seabed is pushed up into that water column. So the wave then travels to the shore closest to where the earthquake has occurred, and the other wave travels out into the open ocean. In the open ocean, a tsunami wave can travel at the speed of a jetliner, 600 kilometers per hour. And the one moving towards the coast, as it gets to shore, its speed will drop to that of a slow-moving car. So human beings can't really outrun tsunamis. As it gets to the shore, the lower portions of the wave begin to slow, but the upper portions are still moving fairly quickly, so that wave begins to pile up. So you get your wave coming on shore as a wall of water and material and debris that has been pushed up. So it's like a mass of moving wet concrete. So it's very energetic and can create a lot of devastation in coastal areas. And you would find that depending on your topography, that would play a part in how far that wave can move inside. So it's very important to note tsunami natural warning signs if you're a coastal resident. So if you feel that strong earthquake that you can't stand, if you hear like a roar coming from the ocean, or if you see the sea withdraw, it is going to come back and you get to high ground, whether that is natural high ground or above the third story in a tall building.
Dr. Lakshman, I think you have been noted to have made a pronouncement regarding a forecast for earthquakes, or a very earthquake of a high magnitude to affect Trinidad and Tobago. How do you go about making such a forecast?
Okay, so our forecast is actually for the Eastern Caribbean as a region, because we have seen in studying earthquakes in our region that earthquakes in the magnitude 7 range, that is 7 to 7.9, occur every 20 to 30 years, and those have been following that pattern. The last one occurred north of Martinique in 2007, the one before that in 1974 between Antigua and Barbuda, and the one before that in 1953 northwest of St. Lucia. Those of magnitude 8 and higher appear to occur every 100 or so years, and the last one was in 1843. Seismic activity in the region continues to demonstrate. We record 2,200 earthquakes annually in the Eastern Caribbean. These are above magnitude 2. And all the other patterns for the lower magnitude events have been holding, and therefore we can expect that great earthquake, magnitude 8 or larger, is due somewhere in the region. And because of the nature of earthquakes, because the waves travel, you would find that wherever the earthquake occurs, not only the immediate precincts of that area would be affected. The
Yes.
area that is affected is going to be quite wide. So we all must be prepared.
Not that you've made us sufficiently afraid, or fearful at least. What do we do in the event that an earthquake takes place? I'm saying that because there are people who may not know or may believe Trinidad is immune to earthquakes of this magnitude. What do you say in response to that first? And what do we do in the event that we are prone or be made vulnerable?
Okay, so we should not go away with the perception because we have not seen these large magnitude earthquakes in our lifetime that they can't happen. The first thing we should bear in mind is that our plates are moving together at a very slow rate, 2 centimeters per annum, as fast as your fingernails grow. This is why our earthquakes have such a long return period. And we have in our history here in the Trinidad area an earthquake in 1766,
Trinidad.
north of the Paria Peninsula,
Okay.
so not that far from us, to the west of us, that caused devastation in Trinidad. It destroyed our capital city, San Jose, and is believed to be one of the reasons why it was moved from San Jose, our modern St. Joseph, to Port of Spain.
That's 1776, you said?
66.
66, okay.
So we have had this in our history.
Okay.
And as I said, the current earthquakes, the background earthquakes we see routinely, those that you feel every month or so, tell us that the processes are alive and well. And therefore we need to be prepared.
Good.
When we look at places like Japan, in the United States, when they have earthquakes, they have very low levels of casualties. Yes, it's very costly, but the death toll is very low. It's not like 300,000 in Haiti.
Right.
So it means that there are measures we can put in place.
And,
What has been found is that buildings, earthquakes don't generally kill people, collapsing buildings do. So if we build our buildings strong enough, then we should be in a good place
right.
to be ready for earthquakes. But it's not sufficient to just have the codes,
Right.
because people have to be encouraged to follow the rules. So these codes need to be legislated, and then we must have the enforcement mechanisms to ensure that what must be done is being done.
Well, Doc, thank you so much for sharing the time with us. I'm sure at least we have been made aware that earthquakes do happen and can happen to Trinidad and to Tobago as well. And there are some things we must put in place. We are talking here with Dr. Joan Lachman, the seismologist at the Seismic Research Center at the University of the West Indies. This is just part one of the natural and supernatural disasters. We will be right back. natural or supernatural disasters. Welcome back to JC 24/7, and I'm here with Pastor Malvern Mentor. Pastor Mentor, let's look at the supernatural aspect of disasters. We pastors are often either accused of, becoming cliched in our response to natural disasters. God is good all the time. But then the cynic and the skeptics and the atheists ask, well, if God is so good, why does he allow these bad things to happen? How do you respond to a question like that?
Well, thank you, Pastor Steve, for having me on the program. I think that's one of the greatest questions that could be asked. And how can a good God allow evil? Now, I want to emphasize what for me is the most important thing with relation to God is the fact that God is responsible simply because he's God.
He's God.
And he's in control of everything.
Beautiful.
I believe that as a Christian, that everything that happened fits somehow or the other into God's plan. But, and there's always a but, I also believe that this world is broken, that it doesn't function the way God intended it to function.
Okay.
And we hear about things like climate change and all El Nino and all these other things, which obviously were not the way that God intended it to be.
And the Bible did say.
And the Bible is the whole creation groaneth. Yes, indeed. So it's a broken world that is actually groaning, and maybe the groans are heard in things like earthquakes and tsunamis.
Right.
And so within all of this, there are times when God chooses, and I deliberately use the word chooses, chooses to allow the forces of nature, which are malfunctioning, to create havoc. But it's part of his plan that is undergirded by his immense love for human beings. Now that may be difficult to understand. How can somebody love and still allow something painful to happen? My mom, who I often think is wiser than I am, usually reminds me that it's very painful to do surgery. But at the end of the day, it makes me better. And one of my favorite philosophical statements is, life breaks us all, but when we are healed, we become stronger at a broken part. So in all of these difficult moments, painful moments, I think there are major life lessons that can be learned.
Very good.
And we can all look deep enough and find our faith strengthened by these events.
And of course, one of the responses I would give is that if you are saying that God is so good and these things are happening, these evil things are happening, my response is, well, if no evil thing were to take place, would you serve the good God?
I like that. I like that, and it makes me think about Job. I think that's a classic example that speaks specifically in the book of Job. God called maybe a parliament sitting, and all the representatives. Suddenly, Satan appeared, and he claimed to be a representative. Interestingly, at that moment, God pointed out his faithful servant Job. This was a good man. This was in God's own. I think it was the only time in the Bible that God said someone is good. And yet, it's one of the most painful episodes in the Bible, where God actually allowed the forces of nature and the direct interference of the devil to negatively impact somebody's life.
Okay.
And that brings me to the most important aspect of all of this, that sometimes the things that happen in our world is bigger than you and I. Because for me, I see the bigger picture. That it's not just you and I, it's not just we humanity. There's this huge conflict going on between good and evil, between God and Satan. And sometimes you and I are caught up unwittingly, sometimes unknowingly. And that whole tableau is playing out. And within there, sometimes the human being gets caught up. But I would still like to believe that in the most difficult of my situations that I may find myself in, that God is not capricious, that he has a well thought out plan, that in the end will see me being better for that experience.
Beautiful. Pastor, you have been involved in community services for a long time, and I'm sure you have visited homes where persons have experienced tragic situations, circumstances. How do you go about consoling someone who has just been a victim of tragedy?
Now, the first thing that I remind myself, usually on the way over, is that I will not trivialize that person's loss. And one of the ways that pastors sometimes or spiritual leaders sometimes trivialize losses by telling people that it doesn't matter. Don't cry. God is in control. At that moment, that person's loss must be recognized as something major.
I didn't want to hear that right now.
No, I don't want to hear that all things work,
Yeah,
I want to hear that there should be some meaning
right.
in all of this.
Right.
And sometimes at that moment, the best way that I can, share that meaning is just sit there and maybe hold their hand,
Right.
if that's okay, if that's acceptable. I had an experience not too long ago where, for the first time, I think I looked at somebody and said, I don't know what to say. And I just said, I'm going to be here. And I think my presence here would mean more than any words that I can say. And after all of that, as I'm leaving probably, I try to remind them that even in this difficult situation, that God still loves them. Sometimes they don't accept that because the thought of God loving me and allowing me to go through this. And I remind them that at this moment, it may be difficult to comprehend, but don't give up on God at this moment. Because usually in moments of tragedy, we don't make the best decisions. So like in everything else, give yourself some time.
You know what I like about your experience? You said you didn't have the words to say, you didn't know what to say. And sometimes that's the best response. Sometimes not saying anything. Because we run away with the idea that we have to say something to comfort a person's heart. But just knowing that the person is there brings comfort to the person's heart. And we sometimes have to accept the fact that it's not words sometimes.
It's not words. Sometimes it's just the presence.
It's the presence of the individual. Should we continue to pray for protection if these things are going to happen and devastate us? What's the value in doing that?
I was expecting that question. And my answer is yes.
Sure.
Because prayer is not meaningless. It is deeply meaningful. Why do I say that? The first thing, and I like to say, when my kids were younger, they asked me for stuff because I was their dad. I provided food, clothing, shelter. And so by asking me, they were recognizing that I had more than they did.
Right.
So for me, prayer is recognizing the power and authority of God. Prayer is also my humbling myself before God and say, Lord, I don't understand what's going on, or I can't deal with it, or I can't change it, but you can. And then finally, prayer is also saying, Lord, even if something's going to happen, make me ready for it. And I can sleep at night. I can go on a plane. I can go in a submarine, which would scare the living daylight out of me, but still feel relatively comfortable knowing that I have prayed and say, Lord, take care of me. And even if he chooses not to, then that for me is really significant, because I believe that whatever happens to a Christian who is following God's plan for his life, that is a glorification of God's will. And so whatever happens to me, if God can use that to glorify himself, to be a teaching moment for the rest of humanity, then my life would have served the purpose. So I pray.
Which brings me to our final question. What lessons can we learn from tragedy and disasters when they do happen?
I think it brings us right back to the beginning where I started. I think for the Christian, the lesson that we can learn is that God is in control. If he was not in control, if I could not believe that he was in control, then life would be meaningless. If I thought that natural disasters just came about because of the random acts of nature groaning, as the Bible says, or because there's an evil devil who is out to get me, then there's no plan, there's no reason for my existence. And anytime something happens. But when I can believe that God is in control, that God loves me, then I can see his footsteps, his handprints in everything that happens. And I can try to find meaning. There's something that I maybe want to add. I was in the Dominican Republic not too long ago, about 2-3 years ago. And as we were leaving, we flew over Haiti. And it's the only place that I can remember actually seeing the border. On the Dominican Republic side, the trees are lush. There's actually forest.
Wow.
On the Haitian side of the border, it's bare ground. Now, Haiti is prone to flooding.
Right.
Haiti is prone to soil erosion simply because whatever the economic circumstances were, they took all of the trees away. And so because of man's action, now, we're not going to go into the social issues, but because of man's action, the earth in Haiti is more prone to natural disasters than on the Dominican Republic. So sometimes because of our own actions, we create a situation where natural disasters occur. We build on the riverbanks.
Right.
We and then when the flood comes, we go and say, "Hey, the flood came, but you knew." So there is also a lesson here for preventative actions by the human being.
Beautiful.
So God is in control.
Right.
But sometimes we as human beings can also take responsibility for what could happen and find ourselves in God's plan for
It
our
reminds me of that parable that Christ gave in the Sermon on the Mount. Kingdom of heaven is likened to a guy who, when he hears my words, he builds a firm
Yes,
foundation,
yes,
applies them,
yes,
and then
it will.
when the winds come, he said not if, but when the winds
When
come,
it will
it
come.
will come.
It will
He
come.
still has something upon which to stand. So I think in wrapping up, trying to bring this thing to a conclusion, one of the things we have to look at, or two of the things we have to look at, one, sometimes natural disasters come to test our resolve
Yes.
with God, our commitment to God, or sometimes they come to introduce us to God in spite of it all. Because there would have been instances, I'm sure, that you would have met persons who can give a testimony. One or two persons come out and say, hey, in spite of it all, I know God is still alive.
I think in every in there's always these stories after natural disaster of something outwardly happening. You know,
Right.
a little child survives when everybody else dies, and stuff like that.
Right.
It shows that, and when we see situations, 9/11, for example,
Right.
the first thing that people did after 9/11, it wasn't a natural event, but it was a disaster.
Right.
They headed to church.
Mm.
There is this feeling, and Durkheim, who I love to disagree with, but I love his, he says that religion for many people is creating a relationship just like your childhood, where you find safety in God. You know, when bad things happen to human beings, it overwhelms their capacity to deal with, and we turn to something bigger than ourselves. And so sometimes, ever so often, God reminds us, I am here, I love you, and I can care for you.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was a way to conclude our program. Pastor Mento, thank you for taking the time to be with us on JC 24/7. Psalm 46 verse 1 says, God is our refuge and our strength. How else would you know that he's your refuge except the storms come? Now you realize what a strong foothold he has been in your life. All things still work together for good, but only to them that love the Lord. My advice, get to love him, and you will see the good in everything that happens to you. Thank you for being with us on JC 24/7, and we look forward again to having you join us. See you then.